The air in the legal office was cold, sterile, and completely silent. Across the polished table sat my stepfather, Rick, a man who measured the world in sweat and sawdust. He was trying to look relaxed, leaning back in his chair as he explained to the base commander that I was just an emotional, unstable girl. My mother, Sharon, a woman who had mastered the art of becoming wallpaper, in the face of conflict, just sat beside him, nodding faintly. I, meanwhile, said nothing. I just watched the colonel, a man whose gaze could cut steel. The colonel let the silence hang for a moment before he slowly raised a hand, stopping Rick mid-sentence. He looked down at a file, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Mr. Jensen," he began, "the signal we received from Warrant Officer Miller's terminal wasn't a 911 call. It was a single-packet data burst that triggered Ares Protocol." He paused, letting the unfamiliar words sink in. "That protocol is reserved for one scenario, a Tier 1 intelligence asset, under direct physical threat from a hostile domestic actor." Rick's smug expression just dissolved. The color drained from his face, replaced by a pasty mask of confusion that quickly curdled into pure terror. My mother's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a dawning horror she couldn't comprehend. They were no longer in a family argument. They were in a national security briefing they had caused. That moment of dreadful clarity was the end of a very long day. It had all started just 12 hours earlier with their arrival at my on-post quarters at Fort Meade for what my mother had insisted would be a nice family weekend. I was giving them a tour of the common areas on my floor, trying to bridge the gap that had always existed between my world and theirs. The quiet academic atmosphere seemed to personally offend Rick. "So this is where you stare at a computer all day?" He scoffed, his voice echoing in the hallway. "Real high-speed stuff." He then paused before a framed photograph of my unit. We were in our professional attire, no weapons, no grit, just a group of focused analysts. He jabbed a thick finger at the glass. "Look at these pencil pushers," he said with a laugh. "My son lays concrete foundations. That's a real job." The old internal ledger started flipping in my mind. I saw every science fair project he'd ignored, every academic award he'd called a piece of paper. It was the same old story. If he couldn't lift it, it wasn't real. I opened my mouth to try and explain, to give him some sanitized glimpse into the gravity of what we did here. But my mother cut me before I could start. "Honey, don't bore Rick with shop talk," she said, her voice laced with that familiar placating tone. "Just show us your room." He chuckled, thinking it was just another joke at my expense. He had no idea he'd just belittled me in front of the very walls that held the nation's secrets. To understand the reckoning that followed, you have to understand the two lives I was living. To really understand the person I had become, you have to go back to my teenage years, to the moment my world was permanently defined by two men. The first was my stepfather, Rick Jensen, a construction foreman who believed the worth of a person could be measured by the calluses on their hands. To him, my quiet intellect wasn't an asset. It was a quiet act of rebellion, a refusal to engage with what he considered the real world of dirt, sweat, and physical labor. His approval was a sun that only ever seemed to shine on his own sun. I remember one summer evening with perfect clarity. The air was thick with the smell of grilled burgers and freshly cut grass. I was 16 and I was holding a letter that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. My acceptance into a prestigious university-affiliated early entry program for cryptology. It was my future, printed in neat, black ink. At that same dinner, Rick's son, a boy who moved through life with the dull certainty of someone who had never been questioned, was being celebrated. He had won a regional wrestling tournament. It was a fine achievement for sure, but in our house it was treated like the signing of a peace treaty. Rick stood up, beer in hand, and delivered a booming toast to his boy. His champion, the kid who knew how to fight for what he wanted. Everyone cheered. Later, when there was a lull in the conversation, I quietly mentioned my acceptance letter. I tried to explain what it meant, that it was a direct path to a career in national intelligence. Rick just squinted at me, took a long swallow of his beer, and clapped his son on the shoulder. "That's nice, Chloe," he'd said, his voice flat. "But book smarts don't build a house." And that was it. My life-changing news was dismissed with a single, tired cliché. In that moment, the internal ledger in my mind began to click and whir. I didn't just see his dismissal of my letter, I saw the 10 years of parent-teacher conferences he'd skipped, the academic awards he'd called, dust collectors, the subtle eye rolls whenever I chose a book over a backyard game of catch. All of it was a debt of acknowledgement that I knew would never, ever be paid. My success was silent and abstract, and in his world, things that were silent didn't exist. Later that evening, my mother, Sharon, found me on the porch swing. She was a woman who navigated the world by placating the loudest man in the room, treating peace and quiet as the ultimate virtues, even if they were bought at the price of her own daughter's spirit. She sat beside me, her hands twisting in her lap. "You know how he is," she whispered, as if Rick were a weather pattern that simply had to be endured. "Just be the peacemaker, honey. Your quiet successes don't need a parade." She thought she was being kind, offering me a strategy for survival. But what I heard was, be smaller, be quieter, disappear. That was the world they built for me, a world where I learned to hide my achievements like contraband. But I had built another one for myself, a world they couldn't even imagine. A world where my silence wasn't a weakness, but a weapon. This other world was a place called a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility. To enter it, you had to pass through a series of thick, windowless doors that sealed you off from everything else. The air inside was always cold, and the only sound was the constant, low hum of servers and ventilation, the heartbeat of a hidden nation. Here, my value wasn't just recognized, it was critical. I remember one night, the tension in the room was so thick you could taste it. A red light was flashing on a console, a silent scream in a silent room. My headset crackled to life. Oracle, the watch commander's voice was tight. "We've got ghost chatter on a closed network. CENTCOM is blind, and a special forces team is about to walk into a kill box. They need you to break it 5 miles ago." There was no shouting, no panic, just the cold, hard pressure of lives hanging in the balance. The world narrowed to just me and the lines of encrypted data flowing across my screen. It felt like trying to solve a puzzle in a hurricane, but in the chaos, I found my focus. My fingers moved, typing, analyzing, searching for the one tiny flaw in the digital wall. And then I found it. A recursive loop, a single misplaced character that unraveled the entire thing. I isolated the key phrase, decrypted the enemy's communication, and relayed the coordinates of the ambush. For a few long moments, the only sound was my own breathing. Then, the watch commander's voice came back, calm and steady. "Copy that, Oracle. Ambush averted. The team is rerouting." A few minutes later, the door to the skiff opened and in walked the third man who had come to define my life. This was Chief Warrant Officer 5 Davies, a living legend in the signals intelligence community who saw me not as a subordinate, but as a strategic weapon. He was a quiet, unassuming man whose mind held a library of the nation's secrets. He walked over to my station, read the report on my screen, and gave a single appreciative nod. "Good work, Oracle," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You just bought them another day." There was no parade. There was no toast. There was just the profound, unshakable weight of earned respect from someone who truly understood. That one sentence from him was worth more than a lifetime of hollow praise from Rick. For years, I had accepted both worlds. I let them call me a glorified secretary because it was easier than fighting. But that night, when his fist hit my face, he didn't just break the peace. He broke protocol. And in my world, protocol is everything. Later that night, the fragile peace in my small quarters finally shattered. The argument simmered for hours. Rick, his voice thick with alcohol and resentment, finally let loose the ugly insecurity he'd been hiding beneath his bravado. He cornered me between my desk and the wall, his face inches from mine. "You walk around here like you're better than us," he roared, spittle flying from his lips. Before I could even process the words, he shoved me, hard. I stumbled backward, the edge of the desk digging into my spine. My encrypted, work-issued laptop, my portal to that other world, slid a few inches from the impact. From the doorway, my mother's voice was a pathetic whisper. "Rick, please, stop." It was the plea of a woman who had already surrendered. As he advanced on me again, a cold wave of adrenaline washed over me, and through the panic, years of training suddenly clicked into place. My hand, acting almost of its own accord, dropped to my desk. My fingers found the keyboard's familiar shape. I didn't have time to open it. I didn't have time to think. I just pressed the sequence. a pre-programmed combination of keys drilled into my muscle memory for scenarios involving capture, coercion, or duress. A tiny LED on the locked device flashed red just once and then went dark. He was on me before I could even breathe. His hand clamped down on my shoulder, and I felt a sickening crunch as he slammed me against the wall. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded behind my eyes. The blows that followed were a chaotic, brutal blur. But the sharpest pain wasn't physical. It was the image, seared into my brain, of my mother standing frozen in the doorway. She just watched. She did nothing. My consciousness began to fade, the room dissolving into darkness. My last coherent thought was a line from a security briefing, a phrase that now felt like a desperate prayer. The signal is silent. The response is not. I didn't understand what happened next, but I was told later, in meticulous detail, how the gears of a machine I belonged to began to turn with terrifying speed, miles away on the sterile, silent watch floor of the Army's intelligence. And Security Command, a single alert flashed across a massive screen. It wasn't loud or flashy, it was a simple, high-priority notification that cut through everything else. It was my duress signal. My call sign, Oracle, was illuminated next to the words Ares Protocol, followed by my exact building and room number. A seasoned watch officer swore, grabbed a secure phone. His voice was cold, precise, and urgent. "Sir, we have an Ares activation. I need the base commander, JAG, and a QRF from the 704th Military Intelligence Brigade. Now." It wasn't a call for help. It was the activation of a failsafe designed to protect a national security asset, and the response was already in motion. When I walked into the Article 32 preliminary hearing room, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It was a heavy, formal silence, amplified by the polished wood of the furniture and the stoic American flag standing in the corner. My left arm was snug in a sling, a dull, throbbing reminder of the night that had led us here. But inside, I felt a stillness I hadn't known in years. I sat at the table with my representative, a stone-faced JAG captain, and next to her, offering his silent, unshakable support, was Chief Warrant Officer 5 Davies. Across from us, in another world entirely, sat my mother and Rick. They had hired a civilian lawyer, a man in a rumpled suit who looked visibly panicked by the sheer number of uniforms in the room. He kept wiping his palms on his trousers. A goldfish who had just realized he'd been dropped into the middle of the ocean. Rick was trying to be arrogant, leaning back with a dismissive smirk, but the fear in his eyes was a twitch he couldn't control. And my mother, she just looked small, a ghost haunted by choices she refused to acknowledge. Their lawyer began, his voice shaky, attempting to frame the entire event as a simple domestic misunderstanding that got out of hand. The phrase was so absurd, so insulting I almost laughed. He painted a picture of a loving family and a daughter prone to hysterics. Then, Rick took the stand. I watched him lie under oath, the words spilling out of him with practiced ease. He described me as unglued and disrespectful. He claimed he had to restrain her for her own safety after I became hysterical. It was the same script they had used my entire life. Every time I had a legitimate grievance, I was hysterical. Every time I stood up for myself, I was disrespectful. My mother was next, and her performance was even more devastating. Through carefully rehearsed tears, she told the presiding colonel how I had always been overly sensitive and prone to exaggeration. She was confirming their narrative, erasing my reality just as she had always done. I sat there, my expression a mask of ice, but inside the ledger was open. Every dismissed achievement, every ignored cry for help, every time I was told to be the peacemaker. It all culminated in this moment, in this room, in their final desperate lie. When they were finished, our JAG captain rose. The civilian lawyer braced himself for a cross-examination about the details of the assault. But our captain didn't ask a single question that night. Instead, she said 2 words that changed the gravity in the room. "Call CW 5 Davies." A ripple of confusion went through the other side. Davies walked to the stand with a quiet authority that commanded the room's absolute attention. The prosecutor asked him to explain, in unclassified terms, my duties. Davies looked not at the lawyer, but at the presiding colonel. "Warrant Officer Miller is a senior cryptanalytic technician," he stated, his voice clear and steady. "She provides direct, time-sensitive signals intelligence to forward-deployed special operations units. Her cognitive and physical well-being are a matter of mission readiness. Words hung in the air, each a perfectly weighted stone. Time-sensitive. Special operations. Mission readiness. I saw my mother's brow furrow, trying to fit those concepts into the box she had built for her sensitive daughter. She couldn't. It was a language she didn't speak. The JAG prosecutor then turned to the colonel. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "The charge is not just assault. It is assault on a federal officer, and under Article 134 of the UCMJ, actions prejudicial to the good order and discipline of the armed forces." Rick's lawyer started to rise, but the prosecutor continued, her voice gaining strength. "When Mr. Jensen assaulted Warrant Officer Miller, he didn't just harm a family member. He incapacitated a Tier 1 intelligence asset. Tier 1 intelligence asset." The phrase landed like a bomb. "The Ares protocol she activated," the prosecutor pressed on, "is the same high-level alert that would be used if she were compromised by a foreign intelligence service. From a command perspective, this incident was handled as a potential national security breach." Finally, the presiding colonel, who had been listening with unnerving stillness, turned his gaze directly on my stepfather. Rick visibly flinched, his bravado completely gone, replaced by the raw animal fear of a trapped man. "Let me be perfectly clear, Mr. Jensen," the colonel said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your actions triggered a national security response. You weren't met by 2 local cops asking about a noise complaint. You were met by a military police quick reaction force under orders to secure a compromised United States military asset. You are not in a county court, arguing over a misdemeanor. You are subject to federal prosecution on a United States military installation for assaulting an officer of the United States Army." I watched Rick's entire world crumble in that single moment. The man who prided himself on being the ultimate authority, the king of his small domestic castle, was being crushed by a power so far beyond his comprehension that it might as well have been alien. He finally understood. He hadn't just picked a fight with his stepdaughter. He had picked a fight with the U.S. Army. My stepfather had spent my entire life judging me by the calluses on a man's hands. In the end, his fate was sealed by a single keystroke from mine, as the colonel's final words settled. In the silent room, 2 uniformed military police officers moved with quiet efficiency. The metallic click of the handcuffs locking around Rick's wrists was the loudest sound I had ever heard. He looked utterly broken, his face a hollow mask of disbelief. The man who had built his entire identity on being big and loud and in charge was now being led away, small and silent. His lawyer, the man from the rumpled suit, just sat at his table, staring blankly at his legal pad, completely and utterly defeated. My mother crumpled in her chair, a choked sob escaping her lips. The base commander then issued a final, formal order, revoking my mother's access to any Department of Defense installation worldwide for life. She was an unacceptable risk. As the MPs guided Rick toward the door, she finally seemed to break out of her trance. She stumbled towards me, her hand outstretched, her face a mess of tears and desperation. "Chloe, I didn't," she stammered, the words dying in her throat. But before she could take another step, CW5 Davies moved, placing himself directly in her path. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He was a silent, immovable wall between my past and my future. And I, for the first time, didn't feel a shred of pity or obligation. I just kept my eyes forward and didn't look back. 6 months later, the world was different. I read the official disposition of Rick's case in a dry clinical report. He was convicted in federal court on 2 counts and sentenced to 5 years at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth. It wasn't a victory, it was a consequence. It was the system I served, working as designed. Justice, I learned, wasn't emotional, it was procedural. While his world had shrunk to the size of a cell, mine had expanded beyond anything I could have imagined. I had been promoted. No longer Warrant Officer 1, I was now leading my own small elite analysis team. My new office was in a state-of-the-art facility, a place of quiet, humming power where the work we did shifted the balance of power in unseen conflicts across the globe. This new world came with a new family, one forged not by blood, but by competence and a shared solemn duty. I saw it every day when I stood at the head of the briefing room. My team, a handful of the sharpest minds I'd ever known, would watch me, their focus absolute. There was no condescension, no dismissal, just a current of mutual respect that flowed between us. On the main screen, my designation was clear: Oracle Lead. I had earned my place and my name. Sometimes CW5 Davies would stand at the back of the room during my briefings. He'd never say anything, but I'd catch his eye, and in his gaze I'd see a quiet, profound pride. That single look was the validation I had spent a lifetime searching for in all the wrong places. One evening, I was at home in my new apartment, a quiet sanctuary that I had filled with books and plants instead of tension and resentment. I was reviewing a complex after-action report, completely absorbed, when a notification popped up on my screen. It was an email. My heart didn't leap, my stomach didn't drop. I felt a distant curiosity. The sender was my mother. The subject line was 3 simple words: I finally understand. The preview text showed the first few lines of the message. Chloe, they told me about some of the things you've done, the lives you saved. I had no idea. I am so sorry. I stared at the words for a long time. The apology I once would have begged for was finally here, sitting on my screen. And I realized with a deep and unshakable certainty that I no longer needed it. Her understanding wasn't a missing piece of my puzzle. Her apology was a key to a door I had already walked through and locked from the other side. It was for her, not me. It was an attempt to clear her conscience, to rewrite her role in the story. But my story was already written, and she was no longer one of the main characters. With a single, deliberate click, I dragged the message into the trash and emptied it. It wasn't an act of anger or bitterness or revenge. It was an act of peace. My peace was no longer dependent on their validation. It was something I had built myself, in silence, and it was not negotiable. I took a sip of my tea and turned my full attention back to the mission on my screen. My work was waiting. My mother and stepfather saw a quiet girl in a boring job. They never realized my silence was my strength. My job was the shield of the nation.